Okay, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is David Ackerley, well known to many of you. He's been doing a lot of work in the region. He is a professor of plant ecology in the Department of Integrative Biology at UC Berkeley. David. Oh, just a reminder for speakers, we're going to basically be timing you up here. When we give you a 5, it means you got 5 minutes left, and the 0 means you should be finishing up. That's going to give you 5 minutes for direct questions from the audience. All righty.
Thank you, Hugh. Before I start, Hugh acknowledged the whole organizing committee, but since he was making announcements, there was no one to say thank you to Hugh for everything he did, along with Rebecca, Stacy, Claudia, and other organizations. Thank you very much. I enjoyed yesterday enormously, and there's no better way to start your day than with climate change. So thank you for coming for the first talks. Oh, we're back to the boink. Did we ever figure this out?
That's the sound of an apple falling.
Okay. So I'm just going to start with a quick tour, very quick tour, of our vegetation in the Bay Area. And these are patterns that are familiar to all of you who live around here. You know, we start near the coast, and we're in these beautiful fog, drip, wet redwood ecosystems, and then move inland. This is up at Pepperwood, where my fieldwork is, into the mixed hardwood, Doug fir, bay, madrone, a lot of different oaks. That's actually a mix of evergreen and deciduous oaks there. You can't quite tell in the summer when they're not deciduous. But part of that is one of the favorite ecosystems for people who work in this area. The Oregon oak on these north-facing slopes. It's a very cool, a lot of native grass in the understory. You know, a species that comes all the way, that actually comes down from Canada and reaches its southern limit here in the Bay Area. Moving further inland, we can, or on steep slopes, sometimes actually even near the coast, you can get on shallow soils, steep shallow soils, chaparral vegetation, of course, very fire prone. This is on Mount Diablo after the Morgan fire. And then as you reach the edge of the Central Valley, the spectacular annual grasslands, of course, a mix largely of exotics as well as California native wildflowers. So if you take all that and look at it as a vegetation map, I'm not even putting a key on here because the important thing to see when you look at a vegetation map for the Bay Area is the banding of the vegetation from southwest, northwest to southeast, right? Because the dominant patterns are these gradients in distance from the coast. So we have these really strong gradients in summer temperatures, getting warmer going inland, winter temperatures getting colder going inland as we move from maritime to a continental climate. Very high rainfall on the winter storms hitting the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Sonoma Mountains and developing especially the conifer forests. And in fact, if you were to start in Brentwood in summer and drive to Stinson Beach, that is the equivalent of going up a 10,000-foot peak in terms of the temperature gradient. So you can kind of think of the Bay Area as a 10,000-foot mountain laying on its side from the warm interior, like the bottom of the mountain. But of course, the top then is not alpine, right? It's the beach. And here we are at this maritime climate with the warm winter, and just this really fascinating climate gradients. And the lesson this teaches us, and this is just our local example, this lesson is taught worldwide, is that vegetation is very strongly shaped by climate. So temperature, rainfall, freezing events, the fog drip. You know, we can slice and dice it different ways, whether it's fall temperatures, winter temperatures, spring, summer, night, day. You know, some of the challenge of climate data is that it's sort of infinite ways to parse through these complex data sets and think about what might matter to the plants. Now, with one plant, you can get out there and do the physiology, like this species really cares about this, or that one really cares about something else. But when we try to take the big picture, we really just have to step back with these broader patterns. Now, layered on that, of course, there are incredibly important patterns in soils, serpentine soils, some other special soils, and patterns of disturbance, which we'll come back to more, like fire. But we know that climate at a global scale has a very dominant role in shaping the structure, function, and species composition of vegetation. So those are the patterns across space. So it may not be surprising, given those patterns, that when climate changes over time, that vegetation changes over time. And that will be one of my themes earlier this morning, is but what is that time scale like? This is an image of Clear Lake in Lake County, not on fire. And that's a dredging rig in the middle of the lake. This Clear Lake, some of you will know, is a very, very unusual body of water. It's one of the most geologically stable lakes, certainly in the West, one of the most stable in North America. It's more than 100,000 years old. And because of that, it actually contains a very special pollen record. So the pines and oaks, which are all wind pollinated, pollen floats off the trees, drifts on the wind. Some of it hopefully lands on another tree to achieve pollination, but some of it just lands on the surface of the lake. And then it settles down, it hits the bottom. And the next year, another layer of pollen falls and settles down. And the bottom of the lake then contains a record over thousands and thousands of years of the composition of forests on the surrounding hills. And Clear Lake was scored many years ago by USGS. This is actually my colleague Cindy Louie. We're in the middle of an updated project to slice the cores even thinner at Berkeley to get a finer resolution record of those changes. But this is a data set that's been around for many years. So that data set goes back to at least 100,000 years, back to the last interglacial, before the last ice age. But I want to zoom into the last 20,000 years. So the dotted line there is the last glacial maximum about 17,000 years ago when it was colder. Now, it wasn't a glacier around here, right? There were no glaciers in the coast ranges. There was glaciation with Sierra, and of course continental glaciers. But it was a lot colder, and look at that forest. It was mostly pines and other conifers. Actually, some of these other conifers, and it's a range of cedars and other things that actually can't tell the difference between the pollen, so they're all recorded as one group. They're actually dominant through the ice ages. Then there's a spike in pine. That's kind of interesting. Is that like the disturbance of the change in vegetation, because many pines are more early successional. And then the pines drop out. And over about 3,000 years, it goes from a pine forest to an oak forest. So if you were to walk into Yosemite Valley, or maybe a little higher, and see a great ponderosa pine forest, and someone said to you, this will all be an oak forest, that's a significant change, right? We all are attached to these landscapes, and we're attached to what they look like. And thinking about major vegetation shifting from one to another really alters the way we look at a lot of the landscapes. And this is what happens when climate changes. But the second message there is time. It took about 3,000 years, okay? So there's a lot of talk about climate change, and I'll talk more about it now in this century. But we have very little knowledge about how fast these changes can occur. We really don't know what can happen in 100 years. We know it can happen in 3,000 years. And we don't know if the vegetation can change much faster, and it was simply that's how fast the temperature is changing. Or is that, is that maybe the limit of how fast the vegetation can change? These are just very difficult questions to answer from the fossil record. We have very few fossil record examples of change, if any examples of changes as fast as the changes we expect in this century. So to shift to the future, we are in an era of running our society on fossil fuels. We are all the beneficiaries of this decision that we all made socially about 170 years ago. They are incredibly efficient, energy dense, easy to move around the world, easy to build an industrial society on, and really hard to wean yourself on. So this is the record over the last 60 years of the annual emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. You can actually see certain events. 2008, you can actually see the recession, that little dip towards the end. And then you actually see a little flattening. There are a lot of things changing. China is changing its energy patterns. Electrification is changing its economic factors. And the question is, where does this curve go in the future? When the IPCC has modeled this, so this is the international governmental or intergovernmental body that has brought together governments from around the world, they've looked at a range of scenarios. So these scenarios, this is not temperature, this is carbon emissions. Like how much carbon are we going to put in the atmosphere year after year after year after year? And if you're in the lingo of climate change these days, it's all about those numbers on the right. So if you go around talking about RCP 8.5 and RCP 6, then you're really in the know. People are like, oh, they know their climate change suffering. But actually, all you have to know is bigger numbers are worse, okay? So bigger numbers mean more carbon, and more carbon means warmer temperatures and more climate change. RCP 8.5 is something approximating business as usual, the scenario that we've been on for the last 50 years, but we're shifting. If we were to achieve the goals laid out in the Paris agreements, that curve would be somewhere between 6 and 8.5. It'd be coming down. It wouldn't be, we're not on anything close to a trajectory of complete renewable energy. But certainly, RCP 8.5 is no longer business as usual. I think we're just bending the curve and beginning to get onto lower trajectories. So as you emit carbon year after year after year, it accumulates in the atmosphere. And what this shows is the x-axis here, the horizontal axis, is the total amount of carbon emitted by humans into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay? The y-axis is global temperature. So the black curves, I'm afraid I'm going to blacken the screen when it is. It's a little hard to see the pointer here, but the black curves are the actual historical record. So we're up to 500 gigatons of carbon and 1 degree of warming right now.
This apparently, oh, this doesn't look like a,
Yes.
there's apparently another one that works if you want.
So right now we've emitted about 500, a total of 500 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. Global temperatures have warmed by about 1 degree Celsius, and I apologize that we, as Americans, we're always stuck going back and forth between Celsius and Fahrenheit. The rest of the world figured out one scale they could live with, and left us being confused a lot of the time. So 1 degree Celsius, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And the rest of those curves are, this is the choice we have as a society. How far up that curve do we want to go? So those different scenarios of what our emissions curves over the next 100 years mean, how far up to this cumulative carbon emissions do we go? And it's close to a linear relationship. For every 500 additional gigatons of carbon, it's an additional degree of warming. And do we want to go up to 2, to 3, to 4, to 4.5? Or do we accomplish this goal that has been set as a global goal of under 2? And of course, Governor Brown has been an international leader in pushing the under 2. The IPCC will come out, the UN will come out this fall, pushing for under 1.5, saying that even under 2 is high risk as a society. And yet we're not even close to getting on the under 2 trajectory. So this is the world we all live in, engaging individually, as a community, as a state. We're a leader in California, so everything we do has ripple effects around the world, way beyond the effects simply on our own economy. We are leading a dialogue about the fact that it is possible to transform the energy grid and not undermine the economy, and hoping that we set an example so the rest of the world can follow. So setting that aside, now let's get back to the plants. When we think about plants and think about them in relation to climate, a very useful framing for the whole problem is to really, plants really are really like water. All gardeners know this. And why do we water our plants in the garden? We water plants in the garden because plants have to open their leaves. That little picture in the lower left there, they have to open the pores on their leaves to lose water, because you have to open those pores to get carbon to come in. So for plant to grow, to get carbon in for photosynthesis, they lose water. And in fact, they lose on the order of 600 kilograms of water for every kilogram of growth that the plant can actually accomplish. So it's a phenomenal quantity of water that plants use in order to grow. So rainfall that falls out of the ecosystem, a lot of it's taken up by the plants, sent back to the atmosphere through these pores in the leaves. That drives plant growth. And then some of it gets into the soil, some of it may recharge our aquifers, and some of it runs off into streams. And this essentially sets up sort of two different kinds of drought that we can encounter, especially in a Mediterranean type climate like California. What we term climatic water deficit is the drought faced by vegetation when that water supply is insufficient to support growth. And that is essentially what California plants face every summer, all summer, as we have 6 months without rain. And of course, relying on soil stored water and sometimes very deep water that trees can tap into with deep roots. When there's a shortage of water running off into rivers, then we're dealing with a water supply drought. And that's, of course, what the water managers are facing. Are the reservoirs going to fill? Are the aquifers going to fill? Is there going to be water for humans? But these are very different kinds of drought. And in fact, a low rainfall year can create a water supply drought. But even in a high rainfall year, the ecosystems can still face high water deficits because of that hot summer. So when we get into the seasonality of rain and temperature, it sets up this dynamic that kind of is our California system. And it plays out very differently depending on if you're a water manager, a farmer, or someone thinking about natural vegetation. And of course, this sets up the need for irrigation and a lot of our patterns of irrigation. So what does Central California have in store in terms of climate change? We're kind of in the, temperatures are warming. We're actually right kind of in the middle relative to higher warming at the poles, maybe lower near the equator. The warming in Central California is about the same as the average on a global scale. So if you hear in the news that it says the global temperature, global temperatures have risen 1.1 degrees or something like that, we're about in that order of magnitude. We're not double that, we're not half that. Whereas the pole, like high latitudes like Alaska and things, are warming much faster. So we're warming about in the middle of that range. Inland areas are going to warm more than the coast, which means the gradient from inland to coast will get steeper, the summer gradient. So it'll get even hot. It'll get more hotter in the inland than it will get hotter on the coast. Both are warming up. Rainfall is highly variable. It will continue to be highly variable from year to year. We have no reason to expect that to change. Wet years may be wetter, droughts may be more intense. And these climatic water deficits will get more intense because the increased summer temperatures, even if it's raining, make that summer dry season more intense for vegetation. And that's something we're quite confident about. And then the thing that we're least certain about is fog. the intensity, the frequency, the physics that draws the fog in off the ocean, across the valleys. There's so many different factors, the upwelling, the central current, the winds, the central valley sucking force of that heat. And those are there's still a lot of uncertainty and very low confidence in a sense what the future of fog might be in this century, which of course has enormous implications for coastal ecosystems. So, so here's the meat of the science of this talk, and it is a black box, and I'm not going to open it up. So I think it's a Yogi Berra quote. I meant to look it up. Saying predictions are really difficult, especially about the future. Which is to say, we're trying to think about what's coming in the next century, and it's all projection. We are doing our best to harness the tools of scientific modeling, the tools of social modeling, understanding our energy systems. We face fundamental uncertainties. That is the nature of trying to think about the future. It's hard enough to explain past events. Thinking about last fall's fire, but what about explaining future events? This is a modeling exercise that leads to something a lot of people in the scientific community are engaged in, thinking about how vegetation will change in a changing climate. And basically what we're doing is taking the patterns of vegetation in the landscape, it's cooler near the coast, it's warmer inland, which plants live in which environment, taking models that tell us how those climates will move around, and then basically reshuffling the plants. It's like the plants are like little jigsaw pieces, and it's like, oh, the hot climate moved over here, let's move the oak woodlands over there. And at its core, it's no more complicated than that. But we spent a long time trying to get it right. So this is an example, if I'm not going to work from my lab, looking at a Bay Area that's 7 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius warmer, a drier future, a wetter future. It does in the models. Even though I said summers will be more intense, it does play out differently. The dark blue there are the conifer forests, which disappear off those maps. The dark red are shrublands, especially chaparral shrublands that we're seeing taking over the coast in the drier one. The light blue are blue oak woodlands coming into the interior. These are massive changes. They're actually almost impossible to really wrap your head around. Like, can I actually imagine in 2050 or 2080 that the redwoods are gone and replaced by chaparral? And the answer is no, I can't imagine it. I mean, how do you turn a redwood forest into a chaparral shrub, right? And this goes to this core theme. Maybe given 3,000 years, these things could happen, but what can happen in 50 years and what can happen in 100 years? And I think the main concern I have about the scientific community in this vein is that we turn out a lot of these models where we say this is what the vegetation would look like given a climate of 2100, but we don't know if it's the vegetation of 2100. In a sense, it could be the vegetation of the year 3000, right, in response to this climate change. So we have a lot of uncertainty. And there's 3 core reasons for this uncertainty about how fast things will occur. This is how I boil it down. One is the role of disturbance, ecological disturbance. I'll flesh out each of these. Another, the role of dispersal, and then the role of what we call demography, or the population biology of plants. So let me just dip into each of these. So disturbance is a ubiquitous part of all plant communities. It goes everything from a single tree falling down to 200,000 acres burning, to windstorms, tornadoes, waves by the ocean, sort of anything that disrupts plant communities, especially kills biomass, knocks over plants, and kills plants. The importance of disturbance is that it's really hard for a new plant to get a hold in a community without some space opening up, fundamentally. So disturbance is essential for understanding community change in a changing climate, because it's the moments when the plants die that, in a sense, opportunities are created. And that means that fires actually are very important opportunities, and I'll come back to that theme. They could be ecologically very, very critical to the way that climate change impacts on vegetation plan. Drought is also a disturbance. It may not always be seen that way, but those 100 million dead trees, they're of course a cause for enormous concern if they burn, when they decompose and send carbon into the atmosphere, which now feeds back onto our climate problems. At the same time, that's a lot of land that something else is going to be growing on in 10 or 20 or 30 years. Will it be ponderosa pine replaced by ponderosa pine? Or are there black oak seedlings in the understory that, following this drought, when the tree cover is gone, have the opportunity to pop up? And now we do see transitions from pine to oak, for example, which we've already seen in the Sierra foothills. So these moments, as much as they're sort of a short-term kind of trauma from seeing plants dying, this is critical to the way ecological systems respond. And the dynamics of ecological systems are the changes that happen during disturbances. And of course, fire now is a critical component. So if we go up into the Sierra foothills and see a standard placing fire where maybe a lot of those seedlings are the same species that died, but of course there's enormous opportunity there for other species if they can arrive or if they're present in small numbers to increase in abundance. Here is up in Grouse Hill and Pepperwood. So in terms of this region, in terms of the recent fires we've seen here, a lot of them are oak woodland fires, and a lot of the oaks are very resilient, but there's a lot of dead standing Doug fir, and there certainly are open questions about whether there is a potential for significant vegetation change, because the seedlings are gone also. And if the seed trees are gone, at least locally, there's a lot of patches out there with dead Doug fir. And I would say, as an ecologist, saying that seems like a wide open question. What are those going to look like in 10 years? Is it going to be Doug fir coming back? Or is this a moment that we'll see vegetation change with other species coming into those communities? But again, a lot of it are these oak woodlands that, and as we all have heard and know, these oaks are incredibly resilient. And even if all the seedlings are wiped out, that may be just a temporary setback in a sense, and it may be likely much less opportunity for significant vegetation change in these oak woodland systems, as Scott Stevens talked about yesterday. The role of demography is simply that plants live a long time, so change takes a long time. There's a term that's been coined of zombie trees, which is to say the living dead. You can have a species that is beyond its climate, sort of envelope, and no seedlings are recruiting, and that species, in a sense, is dead. But those trees could be there for 100 years, individually, with the deep roots tapping into the water sources. So which of these stands is a stand of blue oaks, for example? Which of these stands maybe are on their way out due to climate change, but we won't even see it in our lifetime just because of the resilience of these big trees. And on the flip side, when a new seedling gets into a community, we have to, a new seedling arrives, we have to wait 10, 20 years before that is producing seeds of its own. So just the fundamental dynamics of population biology set the pace by which communities can change. I'll just give you 2 rules of thumb from our work. This is stuff that the science behind it is not fully published. So either you're getting advance notice, or it's just all wrong because we haven't worked it out yet, but we'll figure that out. But 2 rules of thumb, I think, for changes in the relative frequency of different vegetation types at a landscape scale. The vegetation on hot south-facing slopes like chaparral, actually a lot of coast live oak in the Bay Area is on hotter slopes, is likely to do better in a hotter future. So which vegetation types are likely to expand? The hotter conditions on the landscape are the source of plants that stand to benefit in a hotter future, if you want to have one takeaway as a rule of thumb. The other takeaway is the species whose overall distributions extend down into hotter and drier locations are more likely to benefit when they're up here at the northern end of their range. And there is, we've done some modeling to back up what I'm saying to you here, but so coast live oak, for example, is something that goes all the way to Baja. And there's reason to believe that there's, as much coast live oak as we have now, there could be more in this area, whereas Oregon oak, which is at the southern end of its range, is likely to be one that faces climatic limits much more quickly from higher temperatures. And then finally, the role of dispersal. So if it's not just changes, even at a local scale, but especially at a larger scale, vegetation change may, if it depends on new species arriving, that is a slow, slow process. Most seeds don't go more than 1 kilometer. Most seeds don't go more than 100 meters. And it's the exception when you have an animal, for example, that can really carry things a long ways. And the long distance events are very rare, but very, very important. They do happen. Hawaii has native plants on it, and it's a volcano that came up out of the ocean. And it's a total mystery how the plants get to the middle of the ocean. If you give them enough time, they'll do it. But there's been millions of years out there. But on the scale of a century, how many of these long distance events are going to happen? And of course, some of the long distance events that do happen are the plants that have really high capacity for dispersal, often plants we consider weeds. And then, but now let's stop and think. What trees or tall shrubs, habitat-forming vegetation set inside the grasslands could come up to, say, Pepperwood, this area, under a future climate? There's actually not that many candidates in the California flora. It's not like there's 5 more oak species in San Mateo County that could arrive here even by short dispersal. The only oak that's not in the region that could really be a significant part of this landscape is Engelmann oak, which is down in Southern California. So there aren't that many candidate species to come into this region. So we're much more likely to see rearrangement of the species that exist on the landscape now than a wholesale arrival of new native plants. And this is setting aside the question of invasives. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I won't get quite to the end. So the message here is that a lot of this modeling we do when we think of climate change and vegetation is sort of what we call an equilibrium. Like once the plants equilibrate to a new climate, we could go from redwoods to shrublands. But the mechanisms of what has to happen for those changes to occur, the fires, the disturbance events, the dispersal events, the demography, that is much harder for us to really understand what the dynamics and the pace of change will be. And those mechanisms are the mechanisms where resource managers can be engaged on the ground. So the whole toolbox of resource management, in a sense, is getting at those ecological processes. So whether it's replanting after fires, whether it's assisted migration of species that we think maybe are worth bringing up here because we think it's going to be a hotter future, and do we want Engelmann oak in the Bay Area? If we want it, we can't wait for acorn woodpeckers to fly here from Los Angeles. It's not going to get here. So these are choices that we would have to make. So really, this is just a background to say that the whole toolbox of management, in a sense, when you put it in a climate change context, we have to think about it in terms of the mechanisms of these changing communities and where they might lead in the long run. So I'll leave it there and happy to answer questions and look forward to the discussion later on. Thanks.
Great, so we could take a couple of questions and you could work off the microphones that are in the aisle. Yeah.
Climate change really is a downer, huh? Not even a question.
Well, as you've seen, I'm not afraid to ask questions. So, about the disturbances, is it not on?
No, maybe raise it up a little bit.
Oh, I should squat. Vis-a-vis disturbance, there we go. Vis-a-vis disturbances and how important they are for adapting to climate change. If thinking about using mechanical vegetation management versus prescribed fire, would prescribed fire then be selecting for more fire dependent, fire adapted species versus mechanical treatment?
Yeah, so a question about mechanical treatment and prescribed burning and vegetation dynamics. And of course, I'll defer it, we can, over the day, I mean, lots of fire ecologists who can dig into it more. The most important difference will be whether you're triggering seed germination. So there's a small class of species where seed germination is triggered by heat and fire that might not come up after mechanical treatment, although sometimes the disturbance is enough. A lot of those are chaparral species, but the oaks, for example, the acorns are killed by the fire. The seedlings are killed by the fire. Acorns are killed by the fire. Mechanical treatment would certainly wipe out seedlings. And their entire mode of regeneration is to come up in the intervals between fires, get big enough to survive by respreading when the fire comes through. So we can get into the weeds of which mechanical treatment and which oaks get through it. But a lot of the oak woodlands are probably, I might regret saying this, probably less sensitive to the mechanical versus burning difference, just with regard to that regeneration of the species. There's lots of other ecological differences we could get into. Chaparral will make a much bigger difference in terms of the effects on plant regeneration. And I'll just stop there because the next questioner is John Keeley, who knows a lot more about chaparral than I
I wasn't going to talk about chaparral, but I'm wondering, have you tried to look at projections for climate change in different seasons? Because I can well imagine for many species, what is really critical are temperatures in particular seasons. Probably the obvious example would be annual plants. Yeah. Winter temperatures, very important. Summer temperatures may be totally irrelevant, and if the projections are driven by summer temperatures, it may be hard to predict what's going to happen to many of the annuals.
So it's a great question, and this is one of the challenges here is linking the mechanisms of physiology with the statistical patterns in the landscape, because the models are driven by where do they live now and what's the climate in that place and where's that climate going without saying which one matters. The models don't really tell us which thing mattered in that pattern when we do it statistically. I think the most interesting example of that, but also the seasons are in there. It's not just mean annual temperature. There's the whole 12 months of temperature and climatic water deficit that emerges from it and the rainfall stuff, and that's all in the future projections as well. But we're not parsing that. We're not saying, hey, let's change just spring and not summer, right? Nice. But this has been a pet project I've thought about for a long time in the Bay Area. Just stay with me for a minute here. It gets colder. It gets colder as you go inland in winter, but it gets warmer right in summer as you go inland. So as temperatures warm, a plant that doesn't like a hot summer gets pushed towards the coast. A tropical plant that might be impacted by freezing, warming will let it actually move inland. So we could have plant species passing each other in the Bay Area if they're sensitive to winter versus summer temperatures, because the two gradients are, the winter and summer temperature gradients are reversed, and that's particular to the maritime continental pattern. You don't get that when you go up a mountain. Like winter and summer both get colder going up a mountain, but the maritime continental has winter and summer decoupled. So Bay Area has some super cool climate patterns itself. Could be surprises, like non-intuitive surprises about how things respond. And it's all about the seasonality. Should we move on?
Let's see if we can do one more question, but remember we are going to have a discussion among all our speakers, so we'll be able to catch you up there.
Sorry for long-winded answers.
I can defer this to later, or hopefully you can answer it now. It's about those rising carbon dioxide trends, and I guess specifically asking about emission versus sequestration. So there seems to be a trend now to treat biomass, the burning of fuel, let's say, for example, vegetative fuel from farms, but also on a larger scale, possibly forest-based fuel. And then the idea being that if it's replanted, the sequestration can declare the entire process, the net process, as carbon neutral. I'm wondering what your thoughts are when you consider the carbon storage, for example, massive trees that are possibly might be removed for the biomass, because that doesn't seem like the equation could hold. And I'm wondering if there are any calculations to understand the sequestration versus the emission.
So this is a very important topic, and people are working really hard on it. So there's no question about that. That's the first thing we'll say. The second is, if we have an ecosystem that can grow and sequester carbon, then burning it maybe is carbon neutral. It's very hard to know how to do those calculations, but it's better if it's not burned and just sequesters the carbon. Right. So if redwood forests can get big, we have second growth redwoods that can get bigger and bigger and bigger through the century. That's the net positive. Just let them get bigger. But in California, when we get into the carbon problem, fire is the game changer. So the plants grow and grow and grow and grow, and then boom, burns here, burns there, and Emma talked about it yesterday, the carbon calculation. So I'm not going to tell you, I don't have an answer. It's really hard to know whether you should count the sequestration of the past against the burning now, or the burning now against the sequestration of the future, if you're even trying to get that carbon neutral view. The time frame really matters. It's tricky to figure that out. And the other thing is, I'm just going to, I can skip my mind. Oh, the other thing that is just often totally missed is what's going on below ground. Because even when we have cycles of fire, roots might be building up carbon, maybe building up below ground, and we don't have a good handle on that. So, and there's air pollution issues. There's a lot of economic issues. So it's part of the governor's platform about emissions is the land base, biofuels, and could be a part of it. And there's a lot of work being done on it, but it's not a simple answer. It certainly can say that. It's not like just a no-brainer, like, oh, of course that's zero carbon, not a problem, better than the alternatives. But it's got to be part of our portfolio, thinking that through. So
thank you.
Appreciate the question.